So I just watched the Iron Lung movie, and one of the reasons why I decided to watch the Iron Lung movie was pretty much because it was the Markiplier movie. It was one of those things that I kind of kind of had to watch because that's just one of those things that everybody's going to talk about. And you know what? I didn't want to feel left out. So I decided to go watch it with some friends, and and I want to talk about it because I really do enjoy movies as well as video games. I don't consider myself like a high level movie buff, but at the very least, I'm able to understand movies and appreciate them more than just like a casual watcher. So, just to let you guys know for this little bit of a review, not really in depth review, but kind of like my experience watching the movie. I had no prior knowledge of what Iron Lung was before. As far as like anything beyond the concept, I knew about the concept because I had watched a video that talked about it once, but I didn't know anything about its plot, about like the plot twists, the characters, or anything like that. I know it's an indie game, and it was one that was really well received. And you know what? At this point, I would really like to play the game and then maybe make a full review of the movie as a video game adaptation kind of review. But really, the watching of the movie was just spontaneous. I'm just a film enjoyer to the point that I can enjoy a 3-hour indie film with no real plot and still have a good time. I can appreciate themes and subtext and all that stuff about media literacy, right? I really like watching movies. That's the thing. It's really hard to make me not, at the very least, understand a movie. I like to understand movies before I speak negatively about them. So, watching this movie, I felt like it was one of those things that I could like sit down, enjoy, and then kind of think about. And that's why I want to make this video. And while I do appreciate video games, I do appreciate films as well. And because I kind of went in blind with this whole project, I didn't even know anything about the production or that much about what led to this film being created or even who was writing and directing it, which will be a point later on. I feel like I'm in this kind of unique position to talk about a film where I understand that were going to be some shortcomings to the film, but I didn't exactly know what those shortcomings would have been. So I kind of went in blind in a way. But anyways, let's talk about the movie itself. I'm not really going to go through much about the plot or give spoilers because, it's still kind of early, and at the same time, it's not really the main focus here. I'm not really here to talk about the actual story itself and kind of break it down in depth. I'm more talking about just my regular movie-going experience here and talking about whether or not I enjoyed the film and what exactly I enjoyed about it in kind of an overall sense. And so, right now I just want to start with the good because there are some good things about this movie that I feel are gonna not be talked about a lot, especially by mainstream film critics, because after all, this is a full-length film, almost 2 hours, and it was made to be sold in theaters. So, like, it's gonna have a lot of expectations, and it's gotta pass a certain bar. But I do want to talk about the good stuff because I feel a little bit charitable just because this was a really low-budget movie, which goes into my first point being that the movie actually did have a pretty high production value. And nothing really stood me out as this was going to be like something low budget, low brow. One of my favorite movies of all time is Clerks, the original Clerks, and there are some things about it that like you can tell that it was an indie movie. It was made by a guy who was like scrapping for change and everything. And obviously that feeling wasn't here with Iron Lung. The movie does feel like a movie, and in fact, I thought that the movie was being produced by a third-party studio with just having Markiplier at the helm, him as the lead actor, while somebody else directed, somebody else wrote. I didn't know that this whole thing was actually made by Markiplier majorly, produced by him. And after watching the movie, going and then looking up what the budget of this film was, $3 million as the budget, which I'm assuming is kind of like a nominal price range, but $3 million for a budget is really impressive for a theatrical release. Like, this is the kind of thing that you don't really hear much about, but yeah, that's really impressive, and the fact that it already made its money 3 times over, that's really impressive, and I'm sure that some executives are gonna look at this and maybe we'll see a renaissance of mid-budget films again, but who knows? We're gonna have to wait and see for that. But this movie being impressive does do a lot of heavy lifting because impressive doesn't heal the $16 hole in my wallet that I paid to watch this movie. It's still a theatrical movie, and because of that, I'm not going to be pulling that many punches here. I'm still going to be really critical about the movie because it did cost money, and I did have to pay for the popcorn, as well as the margarita that I had to take mid-film because, again, I'll talk about those issues later. but I did walk out and went to go get a margarita. So that at the very least, I was having a good time at the AMC that I was watching. So on to my main critique of the production, and this really does kind of feel like a huge letdown, and that really has to be the mixing. All right, primarily with the dialogue. For a film that is very dialogue heavy, more than action heavy, like you're supposed to care about the characters and stuff because again, it just takes place in a small set. It's just within the Iron Lung, and because of that, you're not really supposed to be looking forward to action sequences, even though there are some. Um, Having the voices be drowned out because of the music and other sound effects really is kind of a bummer because that just lets a lot of details slip past. Like I'm sure that if I rewatch the movie, I could probably make more sense of the film, especially if I watch it at home where I can mess around with the equalizer. But watching it in theaters, there was just a lot of things that were really hard to hear, and it really ruins the movie going experience if you can't understand what's going on in the movie. And unfortunately, this did cause me like midway through the film kind of like giving up in a sense. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about the plot. However, I do feel like that's being too charitable, and I think that's why many people I spoke to about the movie felt lost like halfway through the movie. Like they didn't really know what was going on, and they kept telling me like, "Oh, maybe if I played the game before, maybe I'd understand it." But that's the thing about film. It's supposed to be self-contained. You're not supposed to have to watch or to play anything beforehand in order to understand the movie because it's a self-contained package. That's the whole point. That's why a movie is 2 hours long, ideally, because it's supposed to have enough time to kind of explain things to the audience and stuff. And when, the dialogue gets drowned out and maybe there's a critical piece of information being drowned out by the score, then, there's a little bit of a problem there. Though huge props to the movie, though, me being charitable here, huge props for not dumbing down the film and having actual faith in the audience to watch the movie. Markiplier could have totally gone the Netflix route of just explaining everything over and over again, and if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about, in order to get the message across. But the on-screen storytelling does do its job. I get the vibe of what the movie was going for. At the very least, like, it was an enjoyable experience watching the movie, but not really understanding it. But I can't help but be charmed by the legitimate attempt to make a film because it does feel like a film. It feels like I'm watching an actual movie. It's a low budget movie, but it does feel like it belongs on the big screen. This doesn't feel like a TV movie. This doesn't feel like an indie art project. This doesn't feel like a college thesis or something made for YouTube. This really did feel like a theatrical movie, and I'm really surprised by that, especially with more information that I found out later. And, just to keep moving on and just, finish up with the production, to touch on the score, it works. I like how it incorporates parts of the ship's, computer tree or machinery as part of the score itself. Nothing really blew me away, though. It was clever, but it wasn't really groundbreaking, and that's all I really have to say about the score. It does its job, and I think that's good because like there's nothing really negative to talk about it. When it does its job well, it does its job well, and there's nothing really to talk about. So I think that's a plus on the side of the production. Next, I want to touch on the acting. It was decent. Markiplier did not really impress and really did come off as like soap opera-ish sometimes during the first and second act, and it does come off as campy. However, at times I was engaged enough to ignore the fact that this was a Markiplier. I did feel that the character of Simon did come out at times, and he did a well job conveying that. He does an okay job. It's honestly impressive that that how for his first theatrical film, he really does give a good character. He has a cool voice, and I wouldn't be surprised if he were to be featured in more films outside of his own. I just don't think he has that kind of frontman material, at least on its own. And it kind of makes sense, the fact that he does do really well in front of a camera, given the fact that he acts in front of a camera all the time in order to do his little reactions on his little scary video games or whatever. But as far as film goes, right, he has lead actor potential. He just needs someone to bring out his natural talents to bring out that potential. I don't think that he has the directorial or even writing chops in order to do that. I think Markiplier does need somebody else to help him get to that point. And honestly, it was just overall decent, right? I think the biggest pitfalls does have to do with the plot and the script and the writing as well. But we'll just move on to that because the acting overall it was decent. It worked. It didn't feel too bad, and it wasn't anything like stand out either. So let's just move on to the plot. With the plot, I like to call it the guy stuck in a place plot, right? And my favorite guy stuck in a place plot is 127 Hours, and the movie about the mountaineer that gets his arm trapped between a rock and stuff. He's like in a little ravine or whatever, and he gets stuck there for 127 hours. Man, how about that shit, right? And that's what I'm going to be pretty much basing my baseline standard of this kind of movie because it takes a lot of talent to make a movie about a guy that's stuck somewhere interesting, you know? I mean, I guess he really isn't stuck because he still can move around and stuff in his own little room or whatever, but he is stuck inside the Iron Lung, so I think it's a fair comparison here. So compared to the to 127 Hours, Iron Lung does actually a pretty good job at telling that kind of story with the cinematography as well as the character building and all that stuff. Especially the world building. I feel that the X-ray machine does a lot of heavy lifting and giving that sense of horror and thrill throughout the movie, as well as the motion of when the ship crashes onto stuff and it's getting moved around and stuff. It's a lot of storytelling that doesn't require the camera to like look outside the ship in order for us to understand. It lets our imagination ride, and I think that's a very good thing about the cinematography as well as the script. Not really the dialogue, but we'll get to that when we get to that. For example, the movie does a good job in giving inanimate objects character, like the green X-ray camera button. The button is green and it looks like a high-tech device to contrast everything else in the ship, as well as being a good source of light. While the button is really the most helpful thing in the ship to Simon, it's also slowly killing him due to the radiation, which gets touched on, I think, in the book when he's looking through the instruction manual. And so the movie does great in that department where it's able to do a lot of storytelling just through the cinematography. It doesn't have to tell you anything. It doesn't have to like say, Simon doesn't have to go look at the camera and say, oh, this green button is my life force, and it is what is lighting up the room and keeping it like, no, it doesn't do any of that, thankfully. It doesn't go the Netflix route of explaining the thing to you like 20 times over. And I really do appreciate that. And in that sense, I do feel a little bit of harmony with Markiplier as far as like enjoying movies and understanding these parts that a movie is meant to be watched and not heard or like listened to in that sense. Though, again, one of the weaker parts is the dialogue, but we'll get there when we get there. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I also have to give praise to the thriller and horror parts of the film. I think it achieves what it was aiming for, and I was very much entertained. I do love thrillers, and I do love horrors, especially psychological horrors, and, just keeping you engaged in that kind of plot with just the mystery itself and, everything that's going on, as well as the human struggle. I think those parts of the film really do well, although it doesn't really justify the rest of the plot. Again, getting a little ahead of myself. While the movie does do a lot of good things with the plot, it doesn't mean it does it good enough to be exemplary. One pain point that I had is that even though I tried my best to understand the plot and themes of the movie, I still got lost to the point that at some point I just kind of gave up and I started watching the film just taking stuff at face value because I think it really had to do more with the mixing of the dialogue and also the script writing itself. And because of that, it just kind of made it hard to like be super duper engaged in a deeper meaning in the movie, which is very unfortunate for this kind of movie because a good theme can actually carry a movie so much, and it can make it so entertaining because it could add just so much without adding much in the physical sense. Like, for example, a good drama isn't so much about like the actual fighting of people itself, but rather the conflict and the fight between ideas and relationships rather than actual fighting, And to bring up Clerks again, or at the very least Clerks 2, the drama is what drives the movie's conflict rather than an actual physical conflict that happens in the story. So it's just very unfortunate that kind of got lost somewhere with me in during the film. And maybe it's my fault, that's where, again, I'm trying to be charitable here. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe it was my fault that I wasn't able to understand a greater meaning from it. because I feel like that last shot in the film, hopefully with no spoilers here, that last shot in the film, I feel like it was supposed to carry a lot more weight. Like I kind of understood the baseline level because there is a motif that goes along, or not really a motif. Would it be a motif where the characters say the same thing over and over again? I know motif. I'm more familiar with motifs in music. I guess it would be a motif then. Anyways, the motif in the film is what carries. I think is what's supposed to carry the film. It's supposed to be the thing that gives that final shot its impact, right? It's supposed to give the end of Simon's journey that meaning, and it's supposed to make you like kind of reflect in Simon's decisions throughout the film to keep it as spoiler friendly as possible. The problem is that I got lost, and I don't know if that's my fault or if it's attributed to what I think was the bigger fault, which was the sound mixing. But we'll see. Maybe other reviewers agree with me. Maybe they don't. We're just gonna have to wait and see for that. And just kind of to touch on a little bit about myself, which is, I do find it very disappointing that that the themes kind of didn't stick the landing for me, because compounding freaky visuals with well-made themes is something that I love to see, and this movie just couldn't do it, and that's really the part that just kind of feels disappointing. To me, overall, the weakest part of the film has to be the writing. It is the weakest part of the film compared to the directing, to the acting, to the production. It really is not Markiplier's strongest point, and I don't blame him for not being that good of a writer, just because it's hard. It really is hard. Everybody thinks they're a great writer until they write it, and then the material just doesn't come out well. I think that writing really is one of the toughest parts besides directing, and the fact that Markiplier was able to do both acting, writing, and directing, and still kind of come out with a decent product is impressive. But impressive doesn't get you pity points. Impressive doesn't win you Oscars. You have to go above and beyond, and being impressive but ending up somewhere in the middle just isn't going to be something that's going to be recognized as an achievement, which is unfortunate, because I do think that the film is impressive, especially for that $3 million budget. And I'm sure that, again, some executives are going to look at the profit that the movie made, and they're gonna be pretty impressed as well. But as far as critical reception goes, there's nothing special. So talking about the actual film itself, for the first act of the movie, it really feels like every line that was said sounded a lot cooler in Markiplier's head than it turned out in the movie. And because of that, much of the dialogue feels like it's trying to be trailer bait, right? It's trying to be quippy. I don't know how else to explain it. In fact, while I do praise the production of the film and the fact that it does feel like a film, the editing does feel more like trailer editing than film editing, right? And I don't know if this makes sense to anyone. I remember hearing that Suicide Squad had the same issue because the editing team was had a lot more experience with editing trailers than actual movies itself. But I've never watched Suicide Squad, so unfortunately somebody's gonna have to fill me in there. The further acts do get better in this regard. In the middle and in the end, the writing does feel a lot more solid, like it's an actual film rather than trying to sell you a movie. Rather, it is a movie, which is going to be really, which I know doesn't make any sense. All right, this just reinforces the fact that I'm not a writer, But while this does happen, I do feel that the final act was very disappointing, and the movie did a lot better building up than it did sticking the landing. So, if it had a better ending or somehow executed that ending a lot better, I think a lot of the issues that I have with the writing probably would have been forgiven. But anyways, just to wrap it up, because we're at 20 minutes here, and let me just give you an overall summary of my opinions, right? The movie was fine, right? It was impressive given the small budget, but I still had to pay money to watch the movie, so there's no pity points here. Yet the movie did feel like a proper theatrical movie and not like an indie movie or a YouTube movie. It felt like it could pass as a proper mid-budget film, though the dialogue being drowned out by the score is its biggest fault, being that it's a dialogue-heavy film. The concept is the biggest draw and what kept me in, but the execution of the plot leaves a lot to be desired. Its buildup is good, but I feel like its final act just fumbles it, which is disappointing. At the very least, I had fun watching the movie and I was entertained. I would probably watch it again. I wouldn't be like opposed to watching the film again. But is this the critical breakout hit that legitimizes Markiplier's role in the film industry? No. Even though he made profit, the movie is painfully mid. It is impressive for sure, though. It's a very impressive film given the story, but a lot of people aren't going to be seeing that, and I didn't see that. I just went in blind. I think Markiplier has at least two more attempts to make a name for himself before the "Let's go watch the Markiplier movie" loses its draw potential. But at the very least, I am looking forward to see if he does anything else. Because I feel like films like these that kind of shake up the status quo of movies, right? He didn't have to go through a third-party production company that was already established in Hollywood to make this film, or to make it a theatrical run. Instead, what he did was just get 3 million and then just make a movie based on an indie game. I think these kinds of movies are necessary in order to break the monotony that is Hollywood. I think it's a very, very fine sacrifice to have YouTubers being name dropped, so that way there could be some hype around the film in order to get mid-budget films back again. I think that's a okay compromise, in my opinion, because at the very least, these attempts will bring out stories that you wouldn't normally see in the mainstream. I mean, Iron Lung was an indie game after all. There was no way that a big AAA, what is this, the game industry? No big Hollywood studio was ever going to touch this thing with a 10-foot pole. But Markiplier saw the potential out of it, and I think it was through a tweet that he made a long time ago. But the fact that it came out at all, and the fact that it was able to make a profit, I think will turn some heads. And, I think there's some indie games out there that some executive is going to look and say, I want a movie made out of that, make it super cheap, and get some YouTuber to do it. I want to see the attempt. There will be a diamond in the rough there. Most of them will be shit, right? But I think that is a good compromise there. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But, I would like to hear your opinions on this. Make sure to leave your comment down in the description down below. I do have a Discord, by the way, which you can talk about movies in there. It's not just gaming. You can talk about movies. There's a dedicated movie channel there. The Discord server is still pretty empty. I would really like it if you guys would join, so that way, we could populate that stuff. Like the video, this is the secondary channel that I have, so this isn't my main channel. My main channel is mostly about gaming. Here, I talk about other stuff as well. So, I mean, if you're more interested in, like, just random, talks that are low edited, just me kind of rambling on with my microphone, hot mic, just talking about stuff, especially video game movies that I'll watch because of A, B, or C reason, make sure to subscribe. I do really mean it, though. Join the Discord. Tell me about Iron Lung in your opinion, if you have any opinions, down either in the comment section or in the Discord. Thank you so much for listening to me rambling for 25 minutes about Iron Lung, the Markiplier movie. The margarita tasted fantastic, by the way. I really enjoyed it. $16. I think that was fair.